Chapter 8, London, Part 2. Inverness, Hayes, 2 years ago. I never thought in my life I would come to enjoy a particular delicacy such as fried chicken. I preferred my chicken roasted with potatoes or some other starch. The only thing I liked battered was the quintessential fish and chips that was a staple throughout my life. Yet here I was, dutifully flipping chicken on the range as it cracked and sizzled, the savory aroma wafting through the kitchen and out through the many open windows the stone house had. I bought the home last year as an escape. It was a 5-bedroom, 5-bathroom estate nestled in the Highlands, with Loch Ness visible through the large floor-to-ceiling windows that had been added to hewn walls. The property was quiet. The thick green forest that surrounded our home, muffling any noise or disturbance from the town miles away. It was updated, but not aggressively so, maintaining much of its original character, per Annie's request, my polar opposite. She loved the rustic features and the lack of modernity. I suppose I had learned to love it too. Annie was from a small town outside Atlanta, Georgia, and grew up in the countryside. This home felt like home to her. Her parents were humble people. Mum was a teacher. Dad worked at an electric plant outside of their town. She had big dreams and bigger aspirations and managed to secure a spot at Oxford Medical School, which is how she ended up at St. Thomas's as the star attending physician at 33 years old, and why I found myself cooking fried chicken of all things on a Saturday evening, a Southern woman to her core. When the band imploded and my life as it was along with it, removing myself from the spotlight seemed like the only option. I bought the home and retreated, healed, a reprieve from that horror that was my personal and then my professional life. Annie continued her career at St. Thomas's and was able to work 6 shifts a month, which allowed her to spend more time with me. She was so different than me in so many ways. She was brilliant, one of the most intelligent people I had ever met. She enjoyed history, reading, and running, but her one love was medicine. That was paramount above all. I had no concept of what it took to get into medical school or medical training or anything pertaining to that line of work. Like most regular citizens, I was immensely grateful for the work that doctors and nurses and the like do, but had no idea what went into the career. I think every boy has the fleeting thought of becoming a physician. I was cured of that notion when I did terribly in anatomy in grade school. I vomited during a frog dissection, and that was the end of that. I had never seen someone so passionate about anything the way she was about her practice, with one exception. And that exception I tried not to think too often of. She lovingly described the human body as cells and tissues and muscles and bones and organs all coordinated to create a masterpiece that worked every day, harmonious, balanced, and perfect. It was simply her job to listen to her patients and the rhythm of their bodies and discovered where the discord lay. I told her she sounded more like an artist than a doctor. That's why they call it the art of practicing medicine, she once told me, her southern accent less noticeable now that she had lived overseas for so long. We had been strolling along the small rivulet that wound along the property, through one of the many trails that was carved into the plush green forest. It was one of my favorite things to do with her. We walked, her small hand in mine, her auburn hair that smelled like vanilla and home in a long braid down her back. We had approached a large rock on the edge of the water, and I helped her climb onto the lichen-dotted surface. She crossed her legs in front of her and sat back, leaning her weight on her palms. I laid on my back on the rock, my head in her lap. She placed her hand on my hair, fingers combing through it rhythmically as we listened to the babbling water in front of us. She had ceased to be plain to me. The freckles that dotted her nose, her uneven lips and slightly crooked teeth and beautiful toned and petite body were all second nature to me now. She was the most calm, the most collected, and the most peaceful person I had ever encountered in my life. We walked almost every day that she was with me, talking about everything that came to mind, endless in our fascination with each other. I think that's what called to me in her. Her inflappable nature, her resilience, and her kindness that knew no bounds. My heart needed hers. Her fingers continued their path through my hair. It sounds like art, the way you talk about it, I agreed, looking up at her. Her lips parted in a wide smile, her cheeks pink from the brisk air. No, Hayes, she'd said. It's like music. Our life had a pattern. I wrote songs or studied for my classes or ran or any number of activities I desired during my retreat from the spotlight, making occasional appearances as required and working with Snow Allegra on various tracks in Sweden when she needed me. I would cook meals and try new things. Annie and I would travel or stay in. We did whatever we felt called to do. After years of medical school and brutal life on the road for me, this was our time to do whatever we pleased. I hummed the melody of I Want You Around and plated the chicken next to the stove, making a mental note to jot down that the harmony would sound better if the piano was in a slightly higher key. It was quiet, the silence of the surroundings making the ringtone of my mobile more startling than usual. Tossing the towel over my shoulder, I leaned across the gray-toned center island for the phone, seeing Desmond's name across my screen. I picked up my phone and answered the call, toying at my lower lip with my finger. Hayes, Desmond said, his voice coming in a rush, thick with fear. What is it? What's happened? I asked, panic filling my words and my body at the alarm in his tone. A pause. It's Annie. There was an accident. I stopped breathing. She's dead, Hayes. London, Solent, present day. I don't know how to explain what I felt. My stomach dropped like the feeling you have when you lift off in an airplane, though it was much, much worse. It felt like the sinking, shattering feeling when my grandparents died. That hollow in your chest that is a pressure-filled void of despair and physically hurts. All of my emotions and more were painted on Hayes's face. Of all the things I thought he would say, that was nowhere on my list. I suppose something like a bad breakup or a cheating scandal, but to hear that he had not only loved someone, but loved and lost her in the most permanent way made my throat constrict with emotion. A confusing swirl of feelings coursed through me. Shock, surprise, jealousy at knowing there was one other, that she had been here and seen what was left of him after our relationship and the shattering of his life's work, that she was the one to pick up the pieces, that she had so obviously loved him deeply, and the larger part of me now, the growing, aching, cracking pit of sadness at seeing him suffer with barely controlled grief. The tears were flowing off of his cheeks in earnest now, the blue-green eyes becoming rimmed with red, and the tip of his perfect nose was pink and cheeks turned splotchy. I was too afraid to touch him, to offer physical comfort. He looked fragile, that I might break him if I did. She had been driving back from the train station not far at all. It was a road she took often, he said, his eyes looking in my direction, but unseeing, riveted in his memory. There was rain, but it was always rainy and misty there. It shouldn't have made a difference, but it did, he whispered. The tree she hit went completely through the glass. There was blood everywhere. She was almost unrecognizable, he said. Fat, thick tears hanging on his lip before landing on his jeans. The light blue fabric was polka-dotted with sadness. He made a choking sound and pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, curling in on himself and sobbing softly. I froze, my heartbeat ratcheting up at hearing all of this, thinking about how absolutely traumatizing this must be for him, to be so young and witness something so horrible to someone you love. I couldn't fathom this, how he had shouldered this alone for years. I did finally touch him then. I pulled him into my arms, placing his face in my neck and stroking the silky strands of his brown hair. He wound his arms around my waist and squeezed, holding me flush to him, and continued to cry quietly. "Can you see now?" he said, voice muffled by crying on my shoulder. I swallowed thickly. I did see why he was so sad and why he questioned me about the death in Ibiza. Why he never let me drive anywhere, no matter how short the trip. Why he seemed so far away and distant. Why he was always talking to his mum, probably the only person who could comfort him. I do see. Thank God. He lay there, and I held him for what seemed like hours until he quieted, until he had calmed and collected himself, soothing him with my hands and whispering, "It's okay," softly into his hair until his tears quieted. All the while, my mind swimming with a dozen conflicting thoughts. "Hayes, I need a moment to think," I said finally. He withdrew slightly, peering up at me and searching my eyes, mildly alarmed. "Are you going to leave?" "I'm going to think." London was cool in the early morning, my Burberry coat fitting in nicely with the other pedestrians. It was early September now, not quite summer, but not fully formed autumn either. I paced along the clean sidewalks, my path taking me aimlessly around the posh neighborhood. Annie was dead and had died tragically, young, full of promise, a life dedicated to others and decades spent to accomplish that goal. The way he talked about her, the softness of his voice, and the tenderness with which he described her. It hurt to hear him talk about another woman with that tone of voice, one that I'm sure used to be reserved for me. Rationally, I understood why he didn't disclose this up front. Dropping a veritable bomb on a rekindling romance would not have been wise. And I'm not sure what I would have done if he told me in Scotland or Venice. To have had our first few rendezvous clouded with her death and the ramifications of it on him. Everyone knows they have an impending death, that life is not infinite or certain. But that realization usually comes about when you're older, more capable of handling the invariable truth. To have family or friends to support you through the loss of a loved one and the loss of your naivety about life itself. To be 23 on top of the world and lose everything you work for professionally, followed thereafter by the loss of someone deeply important. It's a wonder he was still here. And it was that thought that made me rub at my chest to ease the sudden pain, the caving in of my heart threatening to resume, and the thought of Hayes himself not existing in this world, his soul departed, unfathomable. Depthless sadness beckoned at the fleeting idea, and Hayes was living that reality. It hurt. Him lying to me for all these months, the distance that put between us, but I understood why he couldn't tell me, why he kept it to himself, and if I could forgive him. The truth is, I had forgiven him for anything he could ever do long before that September day. Love will do that to you. He was standing back to the front door, looking out of the window behind the piano, his broad navy shoulders facing me as I walked back into the flat. His posture was tense, arms crossed in front of his chest, back rigid. "I can forgive you," I said, startling him with my abrupt entry and declaration. He turned around and crooked a half smile, relief that I had returned evident in his face. "I haven't asked for your forgiveness yet," he said, a glimmer of the old haze arising, sparring with me, attempting to alleviate some of the tension between us. I rolled my eyes at his attempt at humor and allowed a small smile to cross over my own lips before continuing my path toward him. His eyes widened as I made purposeful steps toward him, eating the distance with my long legs in a few strides. I grasped either side of his Botticelli face, thumb stroking over the sweeping cheekbones, the tear tracks that remained on the angelic planes. I readied myself to speak, knowing that I meant every word I was about to utter, and knowing once spoken, I could not take them back. I forgive you because I love you. He closed his eyes firmly, the wrinkles springing out in the corners at the force of their closure. His face seemed almost pained, overwhelmed with the words, at the truth in them. I'm scared to say it, Selene. I love you, and I thought I lost you forever. I loved Annie, and I have lost her forever. I don't know if my heart, if my soul can take this again, he said, opening his eyes and staring at me intensely, pleading with his words for me to understand, to hear him and see him, to see the risk of losing another love, what it would cost him, what it has done to him. I brought his face down to mine, holding his gaze. I will hold your heart more carefully than my own, I vowed in a whisper, urging him to hear the promise in my voice. His face crumpled, breaking the last barrier between the two of us. Relief swarmed his whole body, relaxing into my hold and springing into action. He arched into my hands and pressed his mouth against mine, forcing my lips open with his and his tongue dipping inside my mouth. His hands wrapped around my waist and up to my back, hauling me flush to his body, aligning every rigid plane of him to me, letting me feel his hardness and want and lust and love, losing control, freeing himself of every burden he had carried. There is nothing like forgiveness sex with Hayes Campbell. I suppose that's what I would call it. We had fucked, made love, had sad sex and reconnecting sex, but this was unparalleled. He carried me to his bedroom, a green and cream oasis, dark and cozy. He lit a candle next to his enormous bed, casting the room in a golden light. Hayes stripped off efficiently, soon standing before me bare, the flickering light making the shadows of his muscles gleam in and out of shadow. He hauled me off of the bed, removing my clothes until I was equally naked. He placed his hands above my hips, thumbs pressing firmly on the skin between my navel and my stomach. He laid back on the bed, pulling me gently on top of him so I straddled his hips. He took my hand and pulled me down on top of him, sweeping my brown hair over one shoulder so we were curtained by it. His hands traced up my back and to my breast, and he palmed them gently before grasping my face with such tenderness it sent chills across my body. He looked at me then, intense vulnerability in his eyes, laying before me completely exposed, naked in every way. With a steadying and shuddering breath, he whispered, "Heal me, Selene." And so I did. I kissed his face, covering the entire surface with my lips. I traced his muscles with my fingers, drawing and outlining every perfect swell and ridge, leaving goose flesh in the wake of my movements. I kissed his ankle, the one I knew had been broken and healed by her. I kissed his fingers that once loved her, showering him with love to erase the hurt that he had endured. I kissed directly over his heart, feeling the muscle there pounding furiously, as if it would break if I didn't give it my attention. If I didn't love it and care for it, it might collapse with sadness and need. His hands came up to gently cradle my head as I made my path downward and took him into my mouth, caressing the satin-soft skin and licking and sucking gently. He moaned then, tilting his head back into the pillow for a moment, flexing his entire body beneath me in a wave of pleasure. His fingers remained gentle, even as his breaths came more rapidly. When I knew he'd had enough, I rose up on my hands and knees to sit astride him again. He watched me the entire time, eyes never leaving me and watching me with such love it spurred me onward. He sat up carefully, positioning himself above my entrance and holding me steady. I slowly sank into him, inch by inch. I began to move then, holding him close and wrapping my arms around his shoulders and clinging to him. He did the same, mouth and tongue sweeping up my chest to my neck, breath coming harshly in bursts against the skin of my throat as we continued our rhythm. I took his face in my hands and kissed him furiously, wanting to erase every trace of sadness from his heart and his soul with my mouth and my body. I gasped into his mouth, feeling myself beginning to unravel, unwilling to let go until I knew he was on the cusp with me. He shuddered and groaned on my lips, and I knew he was close. I pulled back slightly to hold his gaze with mine, speeding up my movements ever so slightly, driving him to the edge. "Come with me, my love," I pleaded softly, my mouth brushing against his as I whispered my demand, knowing he was near and knowing what this release promised for the both of us. He cried out then, somewhere between a gasp and a moan, and I felt his warmth inside me, my own climax chasing his, a cataclysm of pure pleasure, lust, love, healing, forgiveness, and euphoria, overwhelming and coursing through our tangled bodies, leaving us both forever changed in its wake. We lay together basking in our post-coital satiety, the moonlight drifting through the curtains and bathing us in a soft blue light. My cheek pressed against his chest, his breath steady and calm, his heart beating strong and sure beneath my ear. His ringed fingers traced lazily up my spine, his head propped up on his arm as he reclined with his eyes closed lightly. "I won't hide anything from you, Selene. Only things you can't handle," he whispered, his fingers making their way to my head to rub soothing circles into my hair. I responded, acknowledging his promise and the caveat included in it. "I think after tonight I've proven I can handle you." "You are very capable," he chuckled, bouncing my head slightly with his laughter. I thought for a moment, letting my own fingers trace along the dusting of hair on his chest. There was more? More than this? He knew me well. I don't think I could handle any more at this moment, and I trusted him to know when was right. I pushed him to tell me about Annie, and it nearly broke him to share his story with me. I was hesitant to send him to the brink anytime soon. I rose up on my elbow slightly to meet his eyes. "Okay," I said finally, kissing his heart again, holding his heart more tenderly than my own.